Hello! Welcome to my channel. My name's Abby and I tend to read a lot. So today's video is going to be about romantic books that I did not read for the romance. Just to clarify, these are books that while romance may have not been the key factor in them, it was definitely part of the book. And not that I don't love a good romance, because I do. It's just that for one reason or another with these books, the romance wasn't what really kept me engaged in the story. To start off, the Sherlock Holmes novels by Brittany Cavallaro. So I have read A Study in Charlotte and also The Last of August. These books are a retelling of the Sherlock Holmes stories, which I love. In these books, Watson and Sherlock were supposed to be real people, and whatever stories were written about them, they actually happened. And this follows their great-great-grandkids, Jamie Watson and Charlotte Holmes, who are going to the same boarding school together all of a sudden. This one is following Jamie trying to become friends with Charlotte and then them being framed for a murder. And these books are great. I love them so much. But even though there is a little bit of romantic tension between Jamie and Charlotte, that isn't what really kept me reading the books. I just loved seeing all the Sherlock references. I mean, the titles themselves are references to Sherlock Holmes stories. And I love any retelling of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, also, the relationship between a Watson and a Holmes, getting to see that again is great because Jamie and Charlotte are friends before anything else happens, if anything else is even going to happen. I just love the relationship between the two of them, and I think Cavallaro does a great job exploring that and creating this tension between the characters that was between the original two characters as well. And I just feel like I'm being thrown back into the Sherlock Holmes stories with these books. The next series is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Everyone's pretty much read this series at this point, and a lot of people read this series because there's just so much to interest a wide variety of readers. And although out of all the books I'm going to show you, this is probably the most engaged I was in one of the romances in the story, totally Team Peeta. That isn't what kept me reading it. I loved Katniss as a main character. Really, she was the first protagonist I had read about that was such a strong female role model. And I loved reading through this series and seeing her grow into this role that was kind of forced upon her, but also seeing her embrace it and fight against this society that has oppressed her for so long. She's just such an amazing character, and I loved the entire world that was created in this series. I think it was done very well, and it was so interesting to read through. So even though I did love the romance between Katniss and Peeta, if that hadn't been in there at all, I would have been completely fine with it because everything else that went on was so amazing. The next series that I did not read for the romance is the Red Queen series by Victoria Aveyard. This is a series based on a society where everyone is split based on their blood. So if you have red blood, you're normal, or basically don't have any sort of special powers or anything. But if you have silver blood, you do have certain powers. And this is about Mare Barrow, the main character, who essentially crosses that division, has red blood, but also discovers that she has silver-like powers when she's sent to the royal palace and gets in this horrible situation and has to get herself out of it by using those powers. So this series does have a love triangle in it between Mare and the two princes. In the later books, it does turn pretty dark, actually, within that love triangle, and it gets pretty complicated. But romance was definitely a part of this series. That's not the reason I kept reading it. Mare was, again, this really strong character who didn't really seem to start out that way, but grew throughout the series into this really strong character, but also a really flawed character. And that was part of the series that I loved so much, was that she wasn't put on a pedestal in the eyes of the reader. She had issues, moral issues, that she was dealing with throughout this whole series, which I think is really admirable for an author to do with their protagonist. The world created in this series was also really interesting to read through and to experience. And also, I didn't really connect to either of the princes when they were both love interests for Mare. I was more invested in how she was reacting to all of these situations she was being put in and all these royal politics that were going on during the first book and kind of carry on through the rest of the series. That's another one where if the love triangle had been taken out completely, I don't think this series would have lost much. I think it's a great series even without the romance. The last few books that I did not read for romance are The Dark Artifices by Cassandra Clare. This is the third big series by Cassandra Clare and her newest one, with Lady Midnight and most recently Lord of Shadows. So I've read both of these. I've read all of Cassandra Clare's published works, and I love the Shadowhunter world. That is why I've kept reading for so long. In the Mortal Instruments series and in the Infernal Devices series, I was more invested in the romances there, especially between Jace and Clary. I love Jace and Clary. They're one of my favorite book couples ever. But in this series, which focuses more on Julian and Emma as the main characters and the main relationship, I wasn't as invested. Not that I don't love these characters. I love Emma. Julian, not as much, but I still think he's a really interesting character to read, especially when it's in his point of view. I'm not as invested in their romance as I was with the other Cassandra Clare series. For other characters in this series, I am a little bit more invested in their relationships, but there are a lot of complicated relationships in this series, and a lot of really great familial relationships and just friendships between people that I think are so much more interesting to read about and so much more endearing than any of the romantic relationships in this series. I loved the friendships. I loved the familial bond between Julian and his siblings. And then I also love reading this series because it's part of the Shadowhunter world. I love being able to jump back into that world after so many years being out of it and getting to see some of the characters from the original series, getting to see references to the Infernal Devices series and saying like, oh, that's how this character is doing. Oh, I know what that reference is to. That was probably my favorite part of reading this series, and I wish I did like the romance a little bit more, but I'm not disappointed in the books because I was still so entertained by it and I was so happy with just being able to be back in this world again. So yeah guys, those are 4 series that I have read that I did not read for the romance, even though it was a part of the novel. A lot of the time I do get really invested in the romantic relationships in a series, and that'll be one of the main reasons why I'm reading it. But just with these, I wasn't as invested, and usually that's just because there were things that were more important to me. The protagonist themselves was just more interesting in my eyes, or the world was more interesting, and usually the romance just didn't capture my attention as much. But I still love every single one of these series. I think they're great. I'd recommend them to you all who haven't read them yet. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Click that little subscribe button down below if you want to know when I post my next video. Thanks. Bye.